think about that first thing. I remember I was on fire, and immediately we're like, what the heck? Why was she on fire? That's not obviously a normal thing that can happen. Um, so looking at this first one, I never believed in Santa Claus. Um, and so, just in the context of the novel, right? We kind of grow up um, with the author, right? So her stating, "I never believed in Santa Claus," which is something pretty much every kid in America and most parts of the world has this belief in Santa Claus, um, and she claims that she never did. So it's almost ridiculous that she would have never believed in Santa Claus, but it's such a bold statement, and it's not an unbelievable statement, um, that it kind of draws us in like that. Um, we fought a lot in Welch, right? Look how short all three of these sentences are. We fought a lot in Welch. So this whole, you know, first three-fourths of the novel are all about the family and how the family is struggling together and getting through things together. And there's ups and downs, but they're still a family. But then we hear they fought a lot in Welch. So this tells us a lot of things packed in one, two, three, four, five, 6 words, right? Um, we families together in Welch, right? They just moved to Welch, and we come to understand how damaging and how much of a problem Welch is, right? It's the trap that they get into. It could, you know, it tears their family apart. And we get a little bit of that tearing right here. We fought a lot. This is not the normal ups and downs. This is pretty much all down. They fought a lot. It's not that we fought in Welch. We've seen them in fights before. We've seen mom being chased by dad in a car, right? But now we get, even in this family, she claims that they fought a lot, right? So that's really telling because we know the family. But it also tells us a lot about what's to come. We're going to hear about the fights. We're going to hear about Welch and why it led to these fights. Um, and finally, the third one, Brian and I became expert foragers. Um, Again, we know she's a child, but we also get something of a relationship between her and Brian, right? We establish that close relationship between the two, and then we know she's a child, so it's really interesting that they become expert foragers. Why did they have to become expert foragers? We're going to hear more about that, right? And she goes on to talk about them going through the desert and finding things, right? Um, Finally, we move through different scenes sometimes in narratives, right? Some things we set the scene and then we go someplace else, and we're at school, and the incident happens at school, and then we move home, and that's later in the day, and mom is talking to us about the fight we had at school, right? And that's our incident, is the big fight at school. Is during the day I got in this fight, then I went home, and my mom made me write a letter to apologize, right? And so we have to establish those two scenes. And um, to do that, we can use things such as time. Um, so we can establish in the middle of my junior year, right? So that could be right off the bat, right there, to establish when this happened, because that's important, right? Um, and then you can also say it's later in that week, right? That Saturday, right? So if something takes place, um, at school, obviously it's not on a weekend. And then we can, as we move into the next scene, perhaps, that Saturday, my mom, came home from her business trip and found out I had gotten in a fight, something like that. If you're following the kind of example that I set up at the beginning, talking about how to begin scenes. Um, So let's look at concrete detail. I mean, obviously you guys can read these, but I'll just go through talking about, my my first initial thoughts. So one night that summer, when I was lying in bed and everyone else was asleep, I heard the front door open and the sound of someone muttering and stumbling around in the darkness. So, um, so what we get here is concrete detail, and that's what's important, right? She doesn't just say that one time I was lying in bed and I heard something, right? And maybe that can be engaging, um, because there's no information there, but it can also be really helpful. And these are, just differing ways of doing it, of using concrete details. So one night in that summer, I was lying in bed and everyone else was asleep. So that concrete detail that everyone else was asleep makes this whole ordeal so much creepier, right? That this random hobo stumbles in, right? And she and Brian end up chasing him off and chasing him down the street. But everyone else being asleep, that just heightens the sense of, you know, um, anxiety and maybe danger that we get in the scene. Heard the front door open, right? So she's very aware. We can imagine lying in bed and, we hear the front door open and the sound of someone muttering and stumbling around in the darkness. So these examples of muttering and stumbling, it makes it that much creepier. We're hearing a little voice, and we can't quite understand the words, and that makes it weird. We can't identify what they're saying, so it's not someone we know or something we're familiar with. And then the stumbling around in the darkness, that heightens the kind of, she's lying alone in bed in the dark. She doesn't know what's going on. There's stumbling, so things are falling, things are out of order. So these little concrete details add so much to just someone walked in the front door or someone walked in the house while, everyone was asleep. Um, that afternoon, I was alone in the house, still feeling the itchy, dry feeling of chlorine-scoured skin and the wobbly bone feeling you get from a lot of exercise when I heard a knock on the door. So again, she sets it up with time that afternoon, right? So in the before this scene, she was at the water, she was swimming with her friend. I think it was Delia. I can't quite remember the name off the top of my head right now, but she was swimming with her friend, which was in the morning, right? So now we kind of get a shift in time that has already occurred, and now it's later in the day. Um, and she sets the scene with that little concrete, but also, um, time, words that use time. So she was alone in the house, enjoying the itchy, dry feeling of chlorine-scarred skin. So if anyone has, been in the pool for a long time, you know this feeling, but she really captures it through her use of these words, right? So that kind of goes back to, language is powerful. The words we choose is powerful. Is we all have this feeling, but perhaps we've never put it into words. But when we read these, words in a sentence in a sequence, it sparks something in us. We have that memory, Um, so she's able to make us recall that memory with just a couple words, and that wobbly bone feeling. You know, she kind of makes up this feeling, wobbly dash bone. It's not an actual descriptor, but it's something, any of us who have had a lot of exercise and, a long day kind of have. So again, just this combination of words makes us feel something that perhaps we've never put into words, but we are conscious of. So again, we get that I was on fire, big grab of attention. Um, So, just moving forward, I'd like you guys to take a look back at the beginnings that you started yesterday and see, hey, did I use one of these hooks? Okay. And if not, then maybe you should try one. Think about, where am I going with the story? Should I start broad, because I'm going to get into something really complicated? Or do I need to lay out for my reader kind of how, um, my story is going to be laid out? I'm going to hit on this, I'm going to hit on this, and then I'm going to hit on that. There's a lot of ways, and I'm not saying one is better than the other. Um, it just kind of depends on what you're trying to do with your, paper in your story. So moving on to scenes, as we move into, your assignment for tonight, where you're going to be continuing writing, some of you might be transitioning into different scenes, right? You maybe set up the background yesterday and you're moving into the initial incident, or maybe you've told the first part of the incident and now, like I said, you had a fight at school and now you're going to be home in the afternoon. So how are you going to transition? So good luck, guys.